Welcome to the FEMCAST, where women's voices aren't just heard, they're amplified. This is more than a podcast, it's a movement. A space where we break the silence, spark conversations, and stand together for equality, inclusion, and change. Every episode, we bring stories, ideas, and voices that challenge, inspire, and empower. So if you believe in the power of women's voices to change the world, hit subscribe and join our community across social media at The FEMCAST. Or visit our website www.thefemcast.com. Together we rise, we roar, we rewrite the narrative. This is the FEMCAST, and I'm your host, Anita White-Morn. Today on the FEMCAST, as part of our Gaslit Brain Series, we sit down with someone whose story exposes the truth behind the badge. Former Met Police and counter-terrorism officer Jonathan Wilson spent 28 years serving the public, only to be gaslit, bullied and pushed out by the very institution sworn to protect. Jonathan was bullied, sidelined and gaslit by senior officers, and everything he endured is exactly what the Casey report later confirmed. Institutional misogyny, racism, homophobia, bullying and decades of leadership failure. Failures that haven't just broken good officers, they've also cost women their lives at the hands of serving police. Jonathan discusses a culture built on nepotism, favouritism, secrecy and silence. A culture where whistleblowers are punished, truth is inconvenient, and those who abuse power are protected and promoted, while victims inside and outside the force are left exposed and unsafe. His story is so emblematic of systemic gaslighting that Dr. Jen Fraser writes about him in her new book, The Gaslit Brain. Because what happened to Jonathan is a perfect example of how institutions manipulate, minimise and destroy those who dare to speak up. A masterclass in how gaslighting operates at scale. This episode isn't just about one officer. It's about a policing culture that normalised abuse so deeply that male violence against women became inevitable, and the people sworn to protect became the ones committing femicide. This is the FEMCAST, and I'm your host, Anita White-Morn. You're very welcome to the FEMCAST podcast today. I have Dr. Jen Fraser back, and our guest today is Jonathan Wilson. Delighted to have you on, Jonathan. I've been following you now for 4 years, and when no one else was speaking about bullying, gaslighting, institutional betrayal and abuse, you were our shining light and shining a light on the abuse that was happening where you worked. So if you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself, please, Jonathan.
Thanks, Anita. And hello, Jen, again. My name's Jonathan Wilson. I was a Metropolitan Police officer for just over 28 years. And I should have worked for 30, but my career was cut short because of illness that was a result of bullying and gaslighting in the workplace. It left me very, very insecure and depressed and ruminating a lot. And I had lots of different types of counselling, CBT counselling, seeing mental health services, and eventually I was diagnosed after several years with trauma and had to go through trauma therapy and brought myself around and recovery through that and through reading up on bullying and gaslighting and getting to understand what had actually happened to me over a protracted piece of time in my career. Being bullied and gaslighting came as a complete surprise to me as a white male who was confident, educated, had been in the police at that point for 25 years, really, really believed in the institution and the messages I heard from the institution about behaviour, expectations around behaviour, expectations about how the organisation would deal with inappropriate behaviour and bullying. And having got myself to a senior rank, I was a detective superintendent from 2010. The bullying started in about 2013, 2014. Yeah, I was completely shocked. I thought that I'd seen the worst in my career of life. I'd seen some of the most horrendous things. In my private life, I played rugby and practiced taekwondo. And I really didn't think myself, that I could be bullied. And my friends also said that, friends and family also said that, you're the last person in the world we could imagine being bullied. And that was probably part of the problem, because when I did encounter bullying, I pushed it aside and refused to recognise it because I saw it as, something that happened to other people, that it wasn't going to happen to me. and put down the behaviours to just difficult individuals who I had in management positions above me. And it's the first time I'd ever encountered any of that sort of behaviour. So I guess, a brief overview of what happened. So in 2012, I worked as a deputy OPQ commander, operational command unit commander on the National Olympic Intelligence Centre. And that was a post that only happened we were only in place for 1 year. And at the end of that year, I was then posted on by the organisation, and I was posted back into SO15, which was the counter-terrorism command. Now, I'd worked in there previously, and I had recognised before when I was in there that it was a command where there's a lot of nepotism. They tended to choose the people they wanted in. They tended to bring in their own friends and favoured colleagues, etc. And it's quite a close shop, particularly at higher ranks than the rank that I was in, and ranks, a couple of ranks below me, etc. And certainly above me as well. And I got posted in. I wasn't particularly keen to go back in because it was a culture that I'd felt very uncomfortable with my first experience being there. But at that rank, I didn't have any choice in the organisation, so that's where I was needed, and they posted me in there. They posted me into a position which was where I was in charge of heading up local operations and one of the 4 strands of the counter-terrorism strategy, which was prevent, which sat within the counter-terrorism command. It might sound strange, but sat in the counter-terrorism command, as perhaps seen by others as being a bit out of place, because there were quite a few uniformed officers within that role rather than all detectives. And it was about, a large part of the work was about community engagement and engaging with communities, whereas other parts of the command were around investigating, some of the most serious terrorist offences. However, there was a lot of connectivity between the two, which is why they were all part of the government strand. And I think one of the reasons that I've been pushed in there was to help further integrate that work with the investigation side of the organisation. But I met a lot of resistance. When I first turned up at the command, the then chief superintendent, not one of the ones that's involved in bullying, but said to me, "How did you get this job? We had our own person lined up for this job," etc. And then I got the same from the commander of the commander, and it was quite obvious that there was a bit of disappointment, again, that they hadn't been able to have their own favoured person. Anyway, I got into my role, noticed there was a lot of restructuring needed. There was a lot of work, there was a lot of demand for the work, and I was very top-heavy on management working below me. So as people moved on in inspector roles or chief inspector roles, I was choosing not to re-recruit and to reorganise, because I could bring detective constables and police constables in far more for the cost of those higher ranks and bring them in and be utilised for work. So I started a case of rationalisation around the work, but I also noticed a lot of other things that weren't comfortable for me. One of the things I came across very, very early on was that it seemed to have been for the last 15, possibly 20 years, common practice every year for a lot of detective constables to be taken off to work on the Wimbledon for a couple of weeks when Wimbledon was going on, and to act as a sort of extra security against terrorism. Now, this wasn't an official role for the counter-terrorism command. It was something that had been signed off years before by senior officers as a favour to Wimbledon. And I've been told that was because certain senior officers in the past, if not currently, had received tickets to send to court games because of it. But it involved about 30 officers for several weeks, and it was taking them away for their duties.
Can I just ask you, Jonathan, just before you go on? So are you saying Wimbledon were getting police officers' time on the tax person?
Yes.
When they're pulling in a massive amount of money for Wimbledon, because we see celebrities travel from all over the world to attend. So Wimbledon rings somebody in your office, says, "Can you come? Give you tickets."
Not in my office, but
Well, you know,
at some point,
in the organisation,
yeah.
and so they're getting free time on the tax man.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I put a stop to that straight away. The boss that I had, when I went to him and said, I'm going to stop this, was like, well, I don't know about that, etc. We'll have to see, that could ruffle some feathers. So I'm stopping anyway, because I'm not sitting here and having to account for, if this comes out, that these officers who are being paid for by the taxpayer providing a free security service to Wimbledon. We didn't do it for any other sports, and if it wasn't done at Twickenham or Wembley, when police officers were there, they were there for crowd control, not going in searching bags, etc. Within the, as a site. Most of the, the football matches and things like that, they provide within the grounds, they provide their own security and pay for it. Obviously, stopping that ruffled some feathers. There were other things that I noticed. I had a boss who would call me in to give me a performance development review, and he'd give me a score. And I asked, well, where's the feedback? Well, he wasn't arguing about the score, but I was like, where's the feedback? When I do performance development reviews for my staff, or if my staff are doing them for staff below them, I expect constructive feedback to give given to people, because it doesn't matter how good someone is, there's always room for improvement. And this is the vehicle that we can use for doing it. And I'd like that feedback so I can improve myself. Own self-development, I haven't got a 360-degree view of myself. You, as my line manager, must have input on where I need to improve. Couldn't tell me what that was, didn't offer me any advice on development. And this happened again the following year. That time I expected, having questioned first time round, them to have some constructive, feedback, etc. And again, there was no justification. It seemed to be a tick box exercise, that it was there. We're going to give you a certain score, and we'll give you that score to keep you in your place. We won't have to justify.
Yeah. Can I come in here and ask what that felt like? So your first year, you don't get the feedback that you've asked for, and now you're going into year 2 of a score and no feedback. So from one review to the next review, how are you feeling working with these guys?
Well, I was feeling quite frustrated, because what I was seeing was everything that I'd believed before, and I'd been told that I was going to go back into that, into that command, because I'd seen it happening within that command before. There were favoured people who were given favoured reviews. Now, I wasn't arguing. I never, ever argued about the score I was given. But what I did argue about was, like, why haven't you given me that feedback? Because if I had someone below me, the rank below me would have been chief inspector or detective chief inspector. If they were doing a performance review for one of their detective inspectors, as a second line manager, I'd have to sign that off. And if I got those reviews through, and they hadn't got any constructive feedback, and they just given them a score, and I couldn't see the rationale for the score, and I couldn't see that actually that document, that performance development, that vehicle for helping someone to develop, didn't have constructive feedback in it, I'd send them back to rewrite it, to get it back, tell them why I expected, although I would have told them that before, but reiterate what I expected. And same like, very much I believed in managing up. And if someone above me didn't know what a performance development review was, and I don't think they did really, I think because they'd spent most of their service inside that same command, which was rife with nepotism, and had never really had that expectation of doing what the organisation expected them to do. It was a tick box exercise, because every year the organisation did an audit to make sure that everyone had a performance development review. So all they were interested in was making sure that they could tick the box of saying, yes, we're giving him a performance development review, him or her a performance development review, not that it would ever going to need to have any value. So I challenged that. And I was challenging things about how they were working as well. Some of the ways the investigations weren't dealing with the low-level radicalizers out on the street. They wanted the big, sexy jobs where someone was about to perhaps deal with a bomb, dealing with a bomb or planning a terrorist attack. They weren't interested in people who are out on the streets getting hold of vulnerable people and radicalizing them. So I had some of my officers quite successfully start scouring through all of the crime books across London with certain individuals' names, looking for offences that they'd caused, so that we could target them for offences. When they were running out on the street doing the radicalisation, quite often they'd use intimidating behaviour towards individuals out on the street. So there might be cases of public disorder or assault, etc. in the street. Some of the local policing units were very bereft of resources, and those sort of crimes might not have been looked into further because of more serious demands. But we had the capacity within our unit to go and look at that. And we brought in some quite good successes, and through some of those arrests for other non-terrorist offences, we managed to find evidence of attack planning, etc., for other offences. And we managed to get some of the first antisocial behaviour orders to stop individuals associating with each other. So you had Al-Jamaroon, we managed to stop people who had fallen within the realms of Anjan Chat from, associating with him. So some of them were getting prison sentences, and then they were being told when they came out of prison, for the next 4 years, you're not allowed to associate with anyone from Al-Jamaroon, etc., which would have included Anjan Chowdhury, etc. So we were using, a different way of getting through, and we've been very, very successful. And I think that caused quite a bit of frustration amongst a couple of the bullies, a couple of the individuals who were involved in the bullying as well, because, it was stuff that we got success from, and they started to show a bit of interest in taking on that sort of the work, whereas before they'd considered it beneath them. So what happened is that first boss that I challenged several times around several things, changing Wimbledon, around the performance development reviews, about the way we were working, and about greater integration of the work that we were doing with the investigations teams as well, about supporting that work and about sharing work with intelligence that we had with partners, because it was quite embarrassing. We were sharing intelligence with local authorities we were supposed to be working hand in hand with, and we were telling them, I was going to see chief executives from local authorities with a yearly intelligence report that our command had produced, and they were literally saying to me, this made my blood boil, because all of the intelligence you've given us here is stuff that we shared with you in the first place, or stuff that I could read in the sites, or open source intelligence. We weren't showing them respect. So I was working with Home Office and getting certain individuals within those different boroughs, 32 boroughs in London, the right level of security clearance that we could share a certain higher level of intelligence with them. Of course, this was all going against the established status quo, and some of those individuals didn't like that. They showed no interest in the work, managers, in the work that we were doing or helping us to integrate. They kept telling me that they understood it fully, which quite clearly they didn't. And I got that feedback from individuals in the Home Office and the security service at the time. And they were just like, these guys just don't get his work. Things like excluded me from meetings when decisions were made. They excluded me from, they excluded me from those meetings. But the other thing is, if I said earlier where I'd done some rationalisation around the ranks that I could get more capacity of junior ranks in. So I'd got to the point where I was going to be able to recruit about 8 junior ranks in to do some much needed work. And I went to the HR to say, can I get an advert out to recruit these people? You can't, those positions are gone. And it turned out my boss, without telling me 2 months earlier, had decided that those positions were going to another part of the command. Without telling me at all. There was no discussion, and his rationale was they needed it. But there was no discussion about whether I needed it, or, that was my rationale. If I hadn't rationalised those units, those positions wouldn't have been free, and I did that for very good purpose. So what happened is all of the supervisors ended up with more line management responsibilities, and yet they didn't have the staff to do the work then that they needed, because this was done. But there was no discussion about those resources, and they were taking resources away, taking money away, they were taking vehicles away. Very, very silly decisions, you're not an important unit, so we need to save some money, so we'll take 2 lease cars off you, that were coming out. I think they were costing, those lease vehicles at that time, costing about £15 a day. But it left me in a position where I had officers working around London. If they had to go out to do an inquiry in some of the places and out to London where they worked, because they didn't have a vehicle anymore, they then had to spend an hour on the tube going into London, and then an hour on a bus going out another way to go and make an inquiry, it might take them 15 minutes to then get that bus back in and then a tube back out. So
That
it lost
is
about
absolutely
5 hours.
insane.
Yeah. And if you look at the opportunity costs of that officer's salary, their employment costs, etc., against the £15 saved for losing the vehicle. But there was no engagement to any of those challenges. It was just, shut up. We're not interested in what you've got to say and pushing me aside. So I was just putting this down to really difficult individuals, as I say, people that possibly hadn't necessarily got the best management skills because they hadn't been through the rest of the organisation where they've met other challenges or aware of anything outside their small world of expertise where they were working because of the nepotism. And let me get this straight, there's a lot of good people in management positions within that unit. There were a lot of good people, just some of these individuals that I've encountered weren't. So that the commander, there was a bit of a stink politically. That commander's name was mentioned in Parliament, and he was suspended from his role and moved to another role. And then the line manager that I had was temporarily promoted to that commander's position. One of his favoured sidekicks, who's someone who'd been in the same rank as me, who hadn't been happy about the minor investigations we'd instigated and had success with, was put into that spare role as the acting chief superintendent. On the first day he was in role, he had a staff officer, and the staff officer called me up and said he'd like you to come down and see him. Yeah. And here was the first ambush meeting, because I wasn't expecting anything. I went down there, went to his office, and he said, right, and this is, bear in mind, this first stage in role, I've had 2 members of your staff come down and complain to me about how you talk to them, and they're thinking about leaving the command and they're not happy. And I was like, oh, absolutely gobsmacked, because, I tried to speak to people with a level of respect. I didn't even often used to say to staff, within a hierarchical organisation like that, in my rank, the correct term would be call me sir or boss, etc. Quite often I used to say to people, call me Jonathan, because I wasn't into that hierarchical nature. And I've always talked to people with respect. So I was absolutely gobsmacked. And I'd always had an open door policy for people to come and talk to me, and went around talking to people and spending time with people as well. And I said, well, yeah, who is it? Please tell me, because I want to sort this out. I need to rectify this straight away, because I wanted a team that work together. They don't want to be identified. I said, well, could you at least give me some context about what I've done then to upset them? No, just sort it out. And that was response, literally get out the office, that response. And then over the next couple of months, I had several more of these ambush meetings. And I think possibly my mental health was deteriorating with stuff that I'd already, some of the other difficult, the subtle bullying, the taking away of resources, the exclusion of meetings, the exclusions and decisions. I think it's probably impacting already on my mental health, but I wasn't recognising it. And I was being called into more of these meetings, and they all felt uncomfortable. I didn't quite recognise them for what they were. Looking again, just thinking this is just a really difficult individual.
And do you voice this to anyone, Jonathan? You coming home and saying to your partner or even a confidant in there, I just think, the way you feel it in your body and you feel it in your bones.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't come home and told it to my wife, because we had a young child, she had her own career, and, I didn't really, and also I was sort of a bit in denial, but I did to some of the colleagues that worked just below me, the chief inspectors and senior members of police staff. I did go and have discussions with them and saying, God, I'm facing this again. And they were all quite sympathetic, however, quite scared to speak up about it themselves as well, because that was the nature of that command. Yeah, I was called in for more meetings where apparently I'd upset other people. And eventually I got called in and then I got called in for a meeting being told that I'd upset my peers because I'd not been doing on call. Well, I'd offered to do on call with my previous line manager, and he told me that I wasn't needed.
What is on call?
It's when there's normal working hours. If they need a senior officer is on the end of a phone to deal with any, senior incident that comes through. And I went on to do on-call in other roles after that, and I had done on-call in roles before that, but it was told I didn't need it. I think it was part of trying to put me put me down and put down any experience. There was no question about what experience I had, because when I argued that they were needing people, he then said, "Oh, you haven't got the experience." He's in the police for 25 years. I've done a lot of, and I'd worked in some of London's busiest and roughest areas, with firearms. I was a firearms commander, etc. It was just part of the ostracising me. And then obviously this challenge came in about that. And then I got called, the last ambush meeting I was called in, and I was told, Duncan, who was the previous line manager, has said, if you want promotion, you've got to leave. And I was like, well, I don't want promotion. I'm quite enjoying the work that I'm doing here at the moment. It's quite committed to it. And that stalled the conversation, because I think they thought that, they were trying to tell me that I needed to move for some form of development, which was a bit rich considering I never had any, development in these PDRs, even though I've been asking for it for the last 2-3 years. And then 2 days later, I got a phone call from that individual saying, Duncan says you have to leave anyway. And I said, why is that? And he said, because you upset the Home Office and MI5. Well, that was another one of those ambush meetings where he told me that I'd upset the Home Office and the MI5 with, it was because Cressida Dick, who had been the Assistant Commissioner in charge of counter-terrorism, had organised a briefing around prevent work we were doing with the London Mayor, who at that time was Boris Johnson. And the Home Office and MI5 hadn't wanted that to go ahead, but Cressida Dick, as Assistant Commissioner, decided it was going to go ahead anyway. And she was my most senior boss at that time, and I didn't have any choice, so I had to go along to it. As did several other people who worked in my units. The Home Office and MI5 were completely understanding of that, and it wasn't my choice. But he tried to put that blame across, and I said, "Well, you actually know, you've already told me about that, and you actually know that's not true." And then I got a piece of paper. I didn't get an answer to that. And then I got a piece of paper through being told I was being moved for unspecific development reasons.
If this conversation is hitting home, take a quick second to hit subscribe. It's free, it's easy, and it helps us keep bringing you stories that actually matter. And if you're listening on Spotify or watching on YouTube, go ahead and tap those 5 stars. It's the simplest way to help more people find this show and join the movement for healthier homes and more conscious workplaces. Your support doesn't just boost us, it amplifies every voice we feature. So hit subscribe, drop a rating, and let's shift the culture, one voice at a time. This is the FEMCAST. You say you said to him, that's not true, it's not true, and he knows it's not true. Did you know what gaslighting was at this stage?
I had no idea, absolutely no idea.
So you're going through this kind of scenario over and over with them. And how does it come to you? Like, I know you feel you're being bullied and it is abuse of power, the way they were carrying on. When did it just go, this does not feel right? This is a different kind of, as you've worked your way up through the police force and into the department you've worked in, you would have saw a certain amount of, people abusing their power. But this was different. It was really insidious and it's sinister. When did you know, or how did you find out I'm being gaslit here?
So I basically, for quite some time with all of those ambush meetings and things that have been saying, I had been walking on eggshells and I'd been looking over my back because apparently I'd upset so many people that were unidentified and they never identified who they were or what I'd done to upset them, etc. most of the time. Where I'd had the opportunity, I'd gone around and checked with colleagues or partner agencies, are we working okay? And I was being told yes, etc. was my feeling. In fact, someone from the Home Office, who I'd apparently upset, my contact from the Home Office, I actually went out with socially quite a lot. We were very good friends. So we've become very good friends. So, and it was at that point, that last time, I knew it was just absolute nonsense. And then I saw that form, the way that they changed from one reason that you need promotion to being stuck. If you want promotion, you've got to leave, to a couple of days later coming back a year. I think it's because you've upset these people who I knew or hadn't upset, to then sending something else completely different on paper, telling me I needed this development needs, which weren't identified, and again was completely contrary to everything I'd been asking for the last couple of years around PDR. What are my development needs? And it all clicked in place then. It was just everything I'd been facing. All of this just seems to have been orchestrated. I still didn't know the word gaslighting at that time. I can see now clearly this isn't just difficult people. This has been an orchestrated campaign of bullying. And I sat and I thought about it. I had my own office and I sat there into the evening one night in Scotland Yard. It was dark outside. It was winter time, I think. And I was up on, quite a high floor. I was up on the 16th floor at Scotland Yard. I'm looking out the window across the city and I was just thinking, ruminating over. And I thought, no, I am convinced this is brilliant. And I looked up the procedure for reporting bullying if you thought you were being bullied, and it said you can't go for a fairness at work grievance before you've been to see a senior manager about it to see if it can be resolved. And because of the seniority of the people involved, one was an acting commander and the other was an acting chief superintendent. The next step up was the deputy assistant commissioner. So I emailed the deputy assistant commissioner and said, can I have a meeting with you because I feel that I'm being bullied at work. I'm concerned I'm being bullied at work. And I sent that evening, and then I went home and I was feeling quite down and confused. And I still didn't know the word gaslighting at that point.
And so what happened when you met that person that you emailed that night?
Okay, so this was a little drawn out. So the next day I came in and I got an email from her saying the organisation won't tolerate any kind of bullying. I've made an appointment for you to come and see me next week, which was a week's time. And it was in the evening. It was at about 6 o'clock in the evening. Which I understood because she was a busy individual. It's an individual who I knew had spoken up about within the organisation about women being treated with respect. So I thought this is going to be a reasonable person. They should have moral standards, ethical standards. So I didn't go. When you go to a meeting like that, you're entitled to take a friend or a representative. For me, would have been someone from the Superintendents Association. But again, I was fairly confident about who I was and what I was capable of communicating. I trusted her from reputation, so I went to see her. And when I got into the outer office where all the staff work, she had about 4 staff working in the outer office. She ushered me into her office and shut the door. And I started to relay the things that I felt were bullying behaviour. And every time I gave her an example of one of these issues, her response was just, she looked at me, how can I say, with disdain, possibly disgust, and there was a cold, calculating stare. And every time I was trying to say something, she just cut me off and said, "That's your view." And that's all I got every time I said something. That's your view. That's your view. That's your view. And eventually, there was lots more I had to say. But I just felt some of the answers that I got from her as well. Occasionally she'd say, "Isn't it right that this, you've been told that, around, PDRs and stuff, isn't it right that you've now been given a development plan?" I said, "Well, I have now been given a development plan, but it's not worth the paper it's written on it because it wasn't. I was given things. My development plan was to shadow all of my peers for a day over the next 6 months, was to shadow all of my peers across the command for a day. And yet none of them were expected to shadow me to understand the work that I was doing. My piece of work that the Home Office, the government, were particularly interested in and wanted others to understand, and were saying there isn't a wide enough understanding across the command about this. Yet I was being told I had to go up and shadow other people, in areas that I was familiar with. It was obviously part of belittling my capabilities, etc. It was little snippets like that that made it quite clear to me that she'd been and spoken to the 2 bullies before, because of her knowing about what I was doing in development plan. She was far too senior to have the knowledge about all of these different things in interjecting. And I dried up because I was just obviously wasn't getting anywhere, and I was actually starting to feel quite upset and distraught with the response that I was getting. And obviously I'd had all the doubts because of the gaslighting. Is this me? Is this me? And those things were still going in my head as well. And where I thought I'd picked up some clarity from ruminating, with this response, I was thinking, is this me? And I felt myself crumbling, becoming weaker. And then she said to me, what about so-and-so, who was the other person, the person had been a peer of mine, had been promoted to the chief superintendent rank. And I said, well, things operationally in dealing have got better, but I wasn't prepared to mention any more at that point because she just ridiculed it and there was no point in saying anything. So she then said to me, from everything I hear, you're the problem. And then she told me that I needed to go and that she really thought, she was worried about me and she thought that I needed to go and get some counselling and she was going to arrange for me to have counselling.
Okay, I'm going to come in here now, Jonathan, and total Darbo, as we now know. Jen, from your research, and Jonathan's explaining his story and, the insidious way, the way it started out, the nepotism that was going on in the organisation. Jonathan knows this now, but for our listeners and anyone watching, can we talk about how strategic they are, the tactics they use, and how they actually just bring you to your knees? Like, this is a meeting Jonathan's going in. He's not prepared to be ambushed and they're flipping the script on him and then blaming him for everything. He's one person against the whole organisation, but one that was brave enough and had the courage to come forward. Can we talk to people about the tactics and from Jonathan's story from the beginning when he started in this department right up to that meeting and how it played out?
Yeah, I mean, it's so textbook that it's disturbing. I can, with every single thing that Jonathan's talking about, I can match it with not only my own work experience, which hinged on, so you're saying nepotism, but when you look at the literature, they use the word favoritism. Because nepotism, they'll get away with it because it's not necessarily a family member, but it is a favored person. And this is critical. The three pillars of the abuse system hinge on nepotism, favoritism, humiliation, which Jonathan repeatedly experienced, and then fear. And so Jonathan talked about people are afraid to speak up. Only Jonathan was able to speak up, and that's because he was so educated, so advanced, had such powerful relationships with all the power brokers, but nobody else had the courage to even speak up in that environment. And, you put a target on your back if you have integrity and you have courage and you have experience and you speak up. So all of the people that I've interviewed, and also including myself, it was the people that have Jonathan's abilities that they need to get rid of you because you put the whole abuse system at risk by being someone who has caring relationships, who has integrity, who's talented at what they do. That's unacceptable. You can't run an abuse scenario with someone like Jonathan in it. That's why he has to go. And so I just think it's useful for listeners to recognize that it is so subtle, but the gaslighting was right at the very beginning. So what they do is they say, oh, you created these 8 positions that are badly needed in your department, but we're going to make them disappear. That's like a gaslighting technique. There should be 8 positions, but they make it seem like it's just an operational budgeting. They just moved things. Well, that's just a lie. They took those 8 positions away to hamstring Jonathan's ability to do the work he needs to do. They didn't want him to shine any brighter. They didn't want, MI5 and the Home Office to notice him more. They needed to get rid of him. So the gaslighting is right at the beginning. Well, every single time Jonathan's told you're having complaints, those are just lies. That's fabricated. It's fabricating evidence in order to make the person destabilized and not sure about what's real and what's fake. What's a real relationship and what's a fake relationship? The irony is those people have an inauthentic relationship with Jonathan. They want to hurt him, but they're pretending that they're directing him and caring for him and the organization. They aren't. They don't care about the organization. They definitely don't care about Jonathan, who makes them look bad. And so they say others are complaining. It's that your mind can't even wrap around the madness of what they're doing. And that's why you ruminate. Jonathan is a trained, highly, highly trained detective. of course, his brain is trying to figure out where is the danger, what's a lie, what's true, what's fake, which relationship is authentic, which isn't. Of course, his brain is trying to figure it out because that's what it's trained to do. But he's not trained to be face to face with mental illness, which is what these people most likely have. Every single thing you've described, Jonathan, is a description of what you find in the psychopath's brain. The psychopath is absolutely does things like fabricates evidence to hurt someone. And that's what they were doing. And, you say to yourself, well, that just sounds like melodramatic. That can't be possible. But you know what? It's contagious. And people who run abuse cultures like you were in, who use nepotism or favoritism, humiliation, and fear, that is all coming from a damaged brain. And they make other brains very damaged that are around them, or they attract people that come from usually very sad backgrounds, abuse and neglect. And it's so warped their brain that they're Machiavellians, they're narcissists, and they're psychopaths. They're called the dark triad in the literature, and they operate in exactly the way Jonathan is describing. So it's amazing that you even survived it.
Yeah. So after this meeting then, Jonathan, what happens? Like, you're feeling totally dejected and worn down at this stage.
Well, the next thing I get hit with is I get an email through from the organisation's counselling, and there's a form through that's being filled out by that senior officer, that deputy assistant commissioner, saying colleagues have told me that he's been crying at work, which I certainly hadn't. And yet she hadn't asked me about that. And yet she decided to put into documents saying that I'd been crying at work. So that went through. At that point, I shut off from the counselling. I said, I'm not interested in it. I don't need this. I saw it as, as we discussed, as something that was being thrown at me to try and make me look bad. That it was all my fault. So I shut off. I disengaged from that counselling at that point. I sat on and tried to get on with my work. And then eventually the commander who'd been moved came back and asked for a meeting with me. Him and I had a meeting, and I told him, he said, how are you? And I told him I was very unhappy. I told him about everything that had happened. And he said, I will look into whether we've got somewhere else in the command to move you. Rather than you being moved out to the command. And I found out later that he wanted the position that I had. They wanted to put someone in who was one of their favoured people because they lacked the evidence and community relations to accept working with communities to be able to progress for promotion. A couple of weeks later, he called me back in and said, you're being moved out of your job tomorrow. This individual's being moved in, and you're going to go and work on strategic stuff for the deputy assistant commissioner who I'd had the bad experience with. And I said, I cannot work with her. I've got no trust with her. I can't work with her. That will definitely make me ill.
Yeah. But at this stage, can you explain, because I always say that it's a small little word, but it's when you don't feel it, your whole world is turned inside out, is safe. And explain that feeling that, the fear of going to work for someone you don't feel safe around.
I didn't feel safe. No, I was absolutely horrified, and I think it became so clear in what I said there was absolutely no way I could work with her, having had that experience in the office. Just a complete betrayal. It was that institutional betrayal.
Do you know what institutional betrayal was at this stage?
I didn't at that time, but I was talking in a much simpler language at that point. I was saying to some colleagues, I said, all of the policies, and I actually said this to her in a meeting as well. I said the organisation's policies around bullying and around doing PDR, performance development reviews and stuff like that. I said, it's all a glossy magazine cover, and when you turn the page, the contents inside that magazine are very, very different. And, through experience. And I did say that to her in that meeting. And that's what I was seeing. I was seeing an organisation that looked to put sign bites on the wall to tick the box to say they were doing these things. But actually the reality is they they were there to decorate the wall, and they were there for no reason at all beyond that. The reality of how the organisation operated and the hierarchy operated was very, very different. And I'd lost trust in the organisation, and I'd lost trust in that most senior rank. And that came back in other roles that I was moved to, where I was moved to, and I eventually had to say, I can't work in this role because that person's going to have some responsibility around that, and I can't work with them. I don't trust these senior officers anymore because of that experience.
So, Jonathan, I want, and Anita, you'll see this as well. Do you see the gaslighting, how it works? You have up on the wall, treat each other with respect, which is an outright lie, because you experienced repeatedly that you were disrespected at every turn. We are the keepers of the law. We're law enforcement. No, you guys are breaking the law all over the place. You're breaking policy and procedure. You're actually disrespecting people. And as we all know, this is a wider issue with that police force. They've been exposed repeatedly as not caring for certain groups of people. Those people are on their own. So that's a type of favoritism again. As soon as you care for women or people of a different race in a different way, that's favoritism. Oh, if you're white and you're male, you get these kinds of treatments. But if you're not a favorite, you're going to get humiliation. You're going to have to live in fear. You're not going to get safety from us as law enforcement. Can you imagine what's happening to your brain, which has been trained to believe in these things? It's like having a god taken away from you and exposed as a sham. And, another part of the psychopathic brain that's really critical to this and for people to understand is when you see someone who has no problem breaking procedure, disregarding policy, not obeying the law, all of those behaviors are aligned with psychopathic brains because they don't think they need to obey the laws or do the policy and procedures. According to the book, they can do whatever they want. That's part of the personality. It's part of the dark triad.
Yeah. And that's really, really clear as well with that Deputy Assistant Commissioner. I mean, she was an experienced detective, so obviously experienced in investigations. If she'd received an allegation around a crime when she'd been working as a detective, if she'd received information that a crime occurred, she wouldn't have gone and asked the perpetrators, first of all, for their account before she then went and listened to the victim. She'd have got an account from the victim first and would have made no assumptions, but would then have gone and done the investigation. But the investigation was done before I, as the victim, even gave my account. And then the outcome had been decided, the outcome to that investigation had been decided before I gave my account as well, which became quite clear. And, and again, that played in my mind because that's 25 years, 25, 26 years at that time of the police. That wasn't my experience of how investigations were conducted. And then to see someone so senior behaving in that way. Yeah.
And I think that's a brilliant way of describing it for people who have never been in the police force or have never done this kind of work. And you would automatically assume that you would never question a perpetrator before a victim.
I know.
Get the story from the victim, build your evidence, go back and really dig deep.
Can you imagine if someone said, I've been sexually assaulted and it was this person? And the police said, okay, well, hang on, we will look into it. And then they came around and knocked on the victim's door and said, well, we've just been spoken to the perpetrator. And the perpetrators told us that. And actually, so you're just telling us a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
That's your view. Can you imagine?
It's another really good example of gaslighting. So gaslighting says we're doing an investigation, but in actual fact, they're not investigating because they've already decided that they're going to blame you for the harm that's being done to you. See how the whole thing just goes, it's enough to make you insane because our brains are not designed to face this type of manipulation. That's why it doesn't matter how intelligent you are, how experienced you are, how advanced you are. It doesn't matter because your brain all of a sudden goes like this. When it's faced with, I'm lying right to your face. It's like, okay, my brain can't figure this out.
Yeah. And then the institutional betrayal goes one step further because at that point in charge, the assistant commissioner in charge of counter-terrorism at that time is Mark Rowley, now the current commissioner. And because I said I can't, there's no way I can go and work with this deputy assistant commissioner because of the betrayal. And I've shown, physically that I'm not well enough to go and work with her because of the distress it caused me. As soon as they said you're going to go and work with her, they obviously had a panic, because I went home that evening, and around about 9 o'clock that evening, a very unusual time to be called by a senior manager, but I got a phone call around about 9 o'clock that evening from a second chief superintendent within the detective chief superintendent within the counter-terrorism command, who said, "Can you come and see me tomorrow? I need you to come and speak to me about a role for you to move on to." Now, I'd worked with her before and I'd got on okay with her, but I hadn't worked directly for her. And I was so distressed at that time. At that night, when she phoned up, I actually said to her, I said, "You're not phoning me up to give me any more of this, how bad I am, are you?" I said, "Because quite frankly, I'm at the point of resigning. I've really had enough, and I was. That's how I felt. I remember saying that to her that night. Anyway, I went in to see her the next morning. And I spent the first 20 minutes talking about everything, the bullying that I'd gone through. And I said to her, "Look, you've worked with me. These things have been said about me." I said, "Have you had any experience of me being like that at all?" And she said, "No, but I've heard all about it." She'd obviously made her mind up. It was just that they'd obviously had a panic when I'd said that I couldn't go and work in this role, niche role that they were going to send me to. And that meeting had obviously been between that deputy assistant commissioner, the assistant commissioner, Mark Rowley, and the commander and the two chief superintendents. And because she was the only one that wasn't involved, this female chief superintendent, she'd obviously put her hand up and has tried to say, I can imagine the way she was. She would have said in that meeting, "Oh, I'll sort that out. I've got no connection to this." But Mark Rowley had said, "I've worked with him before. He writes good reports." So she had said to me, "Mark Rowley said you write good reports so you can go work on this project." So yeah, Mark Rowley, who I'd worked for, obviously would have heard the story and no questions about it. Well, that's not how, my experience of Jonathan or anything like that. Everything I've heard about in this, this quick meeting must be right and sent off. So it just shows you the proliferation and etc. You just don't stand a chance in an organisation like that.
One of the things that they do right away institutionally is they erase your track record. So you all of a sudden are no longer, Jonathan, who has worked for 28 years, who has this immaculate track record. Oh no, it's just this little gossiping group that somehow is your track record now. They say that you maltreat people, therefore you must maltreat people, which doesn't make any sense again. You can see the gaslighting. All of a sudden, 28 years just becomes nothing. Your history that proves that they're lying suddenly has no relevance in the conversation. Like, how is that possible? But, it's a repeat thing that I saw when I did these case studies for the Gaslit Brain, is that's what they do. They erase your track record. So 2 things that you said are really interesting to me because they were done to me. So when they say to you, "Oh, you need counseling," the chaplain at the school where I was working, who I now know is a completely two-faced, probably a psychopathic individual. I mean, of course, you can't diagnose him, but all of his behaviors are textbook psychopathology. He said to me, "Oh, don't quit. Just take a stress leave." And I was like, take a stress leave? I was like, I was so, obviously he was trying to get me to take time off so that they could make it look like it was my problem. I'm unstable. I'm weak. I've got psychological issues. I'm crying in the office every day because then it looks like I've got some sort of a problem, right? And so they did the exact same thing to you. Very textbook.
Actually, while you're on that, they did that to me as well. I was told I was overwhelmed. It was COVID and I needed therapy. It's unreal that we all share the same story and they all fall back on, you need therapy. But if they feel that our mental health is low, haven't they a duty of care to actually help you instead of driving you further into that despair?
But what's so interesting too, Anita, is nobody ever talks about we need to get counseling for the people that are showing psychopathic behaviors. Those people don't need any counseling. They can just keep doing what they're doing, like actually damaging other people at work. That's completely fine. But they're the targets, the people that they're harming, that are starting to manifest and show symptoms of the suffering being around them, those are the people that need counseling. It's, again, do you see how that doesn't make any sense?
Yeah. And in the organization, Jonathan, it seems you're able to fail upwards in that place when you're talking about Mark Rowley, and like he has failed his teams, his colleagues, people above him, the general public. And we know that from all the reports, Panorama recently on BBC. But you can fail and fail and fail and still get promoted.
Yeah.
It beggars belief.
Well, yeah, and unfortunately, I think this is part of the politicisation of policing. If I suck up to the right politicians, or if I'm in a more junior rank and I don't challenge anything, the way things are done, it's about acquiescing. You know, I acquiesce to what's happening and don't challenge anything, condone that behaviour and the way things work, then I'll get noticed as a team player and move on. And, you know, this is the same thing. He's now the commissioner. He came in after Cressida Dick had to leave because of the scandal at Charing Cross. And then Casey reported on the bullying and the misogyny and the racism and the homophobia.
If this conversation is hitting home, take a quick second to hit subscribe. It's free, it's easy, and it helps us keep bringing you stories that actually matter. And if you're listening on Spotify or watching on YouTube, go ahead and tap those 5 stars. It's the simplest way to help more people find this show and join the movement for healthier homes and more conscious workplaces. Your support doesn't just boost us, it amplifies every voice we feature. So hit subscribe, drop a rating, and let's shift the culture, one voice at a time. This is the FEMCAST.
Jonathan, tell us about Charing Cross, because that came up recently in the Panorama documentary that was on BBC. So we're in 2025. You're talking about back when?
Well, I'm talking about, I think, was it 2022? I'm not quite sure of dates. The first 21, 22, when the first Charing Cross happened. Louise Casey was brought in to do a report on the culture within the organisation. We felt, when her report came out, she found that in the organisation there was institutional racism, bullying, homophobia, misogyny. I felt sort of, how can I say, relieved. And the very fact that everything that she said supported the sort of things that I'd raised and had been told I was wrong about. You know, there's a lot of good people in the organisation, but there's a problem in the organisation as well. There's a fear of challenging things. And we saw this, where I wanted to go to the point that Mark Rowley didn't challenge in that meeting that it was outside the experience of, you know, the previous 25, 26, 27 years in the organisation. I'd never, ever accused anyone of bullying before or had all these problems that apparently had appeared in that particular role. He took it for granted because it was the easy thing to do and the people above me were more senior. And likewise, Casey's report came out saying about the institutional work. He refused to accept the institutional thing because it was too difficult for him, you know, to challenge and to suggest that, because that causes a lot of distress within a large organisation. People don't like the idea of the institutional. What people aren't seeing is it's enamoured into the culture, as in the leadership, because there's a fear of challenging things and challenging people, and that he's a really, really good example. And what he wants to do is to go around sucking people at the most junior level. So he always wants to blame down at the more junior levels. So, you know, when I was there and that moment was brought to him, he was quite comfortable with, oh, well, that's someone who's junior to these people who are working as my deputies and their deputies. Jonathan's below them. So I'll accept that he's in the wrong, even though he goes against, you know, my experience of him. It goes against the experience of how he's been in the organisation in the past. I will accept that because it's the easy thing to do. I don't want to have to challenge people above me. And the fact is, how difficult would it have been if he had gone in and questioned it and they'd found out there was a bullying culture within counter-terrorism? It would have been a political nightmare for him. It would have been really, really difficult. So it's easier for me to be the sacrificial lamb. Likewise, now, he's come into the organisation saying this stuff isn't institutionalised because he can say that there's not a problem there for leadership. It's about individuals. And he's going round sacking individuals, you know, who aren't necessarily doing the right thing, but some of them are doing some fairly minor minor things. They're not all the officers that have gone around and murdered and raped. Some of them have done some really bad stuff. And yes, they needed to be dealt with. But actually, some of the other stuff, it seems to be hitting small nuts with a sledgehammer, cracking small nuts with a sledgehammer to say the organisation's doing. So they're sucking. He's bragging recently because the heads come up again against Charing Cross because that happened before. It's come up again now. It obviously wasn't dealt with properly because they weren't dealing with the issues at leadership level. They've been going around attacking, looking to sack the most junior officers and not dealing with the leadership issues around it. And it's going to continue to perpetuate whilst they leave those senior officers alone and leave them unchallenged. They're going to feel what they do or what they don't do is perfectly acceptable. Those who follow behind them in leadership positions will see that as acceptable behaviour. So again, it becomes learned behaviour, as does bullying behaviour that's unchallenged becomes learned behaviour. And it's a total failure in leadership in the organisation. Seen when, the position I found myself in, seen after his response to Charing Cross the first time, and now seeing it coming through again. And his response is, we've sacked over 1,000 officers in the last 12 months. But none of them have been any senior officers, and there haven't been discipline cases, at the most senior levels. Those people at those most senior levels who have a responsibility in the first place of getting in and finding out what's happening. Why didn't people know what was happening in the custody suite there? Why does it take the BBC to send an undercover investigative journalist? Why haven't they created, because the BBC have got that information from staff within that police station saying this is what's still happening. Why weren't those people confident enough to speak up in the organisation? Because the organisation's showing no leadership, and anyone who spoke up was fear. They see things that happen to people like me who challenge things, and they think, I'm just going to be the sacrificial lamb. If I put my head up above the water, they're going to come down and clamp down on me. So then they go to the easiest option. They see stuff that's not right, so they go and tell the BBC. So the BBC put people in undercover rather than the organisation dealing with its own stuff in-house.
This is an absolute textbook abuse culture. It's how they operate. The people that are the favorites will do anything in order to get their positions, their promotions, their paycheck. They'll sell their souls. And really, it's the majority, because how many people have the capacity or ability to become the sacrificial lamb? And that's exactly what they do, is they drive you out. If you have integrity, if you're talented, if you try to hold people to a higher standard and say, you know what, I've seen this abuse or that abuse, and I'm not going to look the other way. It's not okay. It's not acceptable. It's not in our policy and procedure manual. Why are we allowing this? They're going to get rid of you every single time. And so this is, it's a widespread culture issue, but look at what it's resulting in. The lack of trust in institutions right now, it's literally threatening democracy. And we can't seem to say to ourselves, you know what, all the things you just said, Jonathan, senior leadership is responsible. Senior leadership needs to be taking responsibility for what's happening. Sacking juniors who are just not being developed or learning is never going to solve the problem. But they won't do it. It's really, in the Gaslit Brain, the final 6 chapters are about how we need to redo the whole system. Yeah, it's a challenge. It's going to be difficult, but I think democracy is probably worth saving, or we can just keep seeing the rise of fascism, the right, and populism, which is what happens when people no longer have trust. They no longer care for one another. They no longer have high standards. All the things that, you take those things for granted. The losses are much bigger than the Mark Rowleys of the world having to work hard and bring about institutional change.
Yeah, and make uncomfortable decisions rather than the easy decisions, because that's what reality today, And so someone shouldn't be in leadership if they're prepared to challenge, if they're unprepared to challenge their peers or direct subordinates, what are they doing in a leadership role? Why do they want that leadership role? And it's about prestige and salary. It isn't about actually wanting to do the right things for the organisation and for the people that pay those wages.
And the biggest gaslighting part of that is they will tell you at every turn that they care more than anything about the organization. They care about the people. The people are good people. They're brave people. As Mark Rowley said back in the past, oh, I've never worked with such incredibly brave people as I did in counterterrorism. It's like, yeah, then how come you don't have any courage? That's my question to you, Mark Rowley.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I saw something on LinkedIn recently where someone who'd worked, because before that he'd worked in Surrey, and someone who worked with him in Surrey questioned, the way that he's treating junior officers and saying, you're putting yourself on this high moral stand, but I remember when you did this, and I remember when you did that, and I remember when you did this, and et cetera, et cetera. And he's not perfect himself, and probably he's been involved in things that he's subtly more junior officers for himself now, or calling for jobs. I don't know, I'm going to say the veracity of those particular cases, but certainly someone who worked with him was making those claims on LinkedIn recently.
I'd say there's a lot more as well, because look what he's prepared to cover up. And it's a case, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It's just so rotten, from the reports, from the Panorama documentary, from people like yourself, Jonathan, that has come forward. We know, like Sarah Everett, those people that they're the consequences of letting this rot continue and the cover-ups.
Yeah, dismissing those are just words. They don't need to be challenged. It's just, that's the way. Or actually, if I haven't heard it, it doesn't matter. But, by not dealing with it, putting out that it's unacceptable. Because that's what they need to do. It's just to set out, this is not acceptable. We will not accept this. Line managers at all levels need to understand that. And line managers need to know if they deem it to be unacceptable or turn a blind eye, they're going to be vulnerable. Their jobs are going to be vulnerable as well. It's not the most junior that should be vulnerable all the time. It should be cascaded through down, from the top down. And even the commissioner, if he turns a blind eye, the mayor should be holding him accountable, and his job should be vulnerable if he's not going to be holding people to account. But going around sucking the most junior officers, it's just, it's appalling. Everyone should be held to the same standards.
Yeah, but we're seeing it all over the place. The more power you have, the more prestige you have, the less accountability you have. That upside down system is a gaslighting system. How can you have all these high moral standards for people that are learning, that are young, that are developing in the profession, and you don't have any of them? It's like, it's a recipe for disaster, and we are seeing geopolitical disaster right now. So.
Yeah, and likewise, you see that as well as you become more senior, you show less emotional intelligence. As you become more senior, you see it that people are, they'll go around telling you that emotional intelligence is important, but those individuals, you'll feel, I don't need to say hello to you today when I walk past you in the corridor. This, my level, you're beneath me. That isn't building up a relationship within an organisation. I've seen some very good leaders at chief constable level who know everyone who they work with. They know the name of their children, their wife, etc., where they've been on holiday. They make it their business to go and know it. And then you'll see others at senior levels who just lose that empathy and that emotional intelligence and just see themselves as above everything and distant from caring.
And the definition of the psychopathic brain is a brain that has eroded empathy. Affective empathy is eroded. And those are very, very dangerous people, and they should be nowhere near leadership positions. That's the sad thing about it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on and telling your story today, and Jen for insightful neuroscience. And we're looking forward to the Gaslit Brain book released on November 4th.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I've read the draft of your book. I'm looking forward to going back through and reading it again.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in to the FEMCAST today. If you believe in these conversations and want to help us keep shining a light on gaslighting, psychological harm and accountability, hit subscribe right now. Your 5-star rating and review make a real difference. They help more people find this podcast, hear these vital stories, and join the movement to end the silence. Dr. Jen Fraser's groundbreaking new book, The Gaslit Brain, is out now. You'll find the link in our bio. Until next time, let's keep building safer, more accountable communities. Because together, we don't just talk about change, we spark it. I'm Anita White-Moran, and this is the FEMCAST. Today's episode was edited by me and produced by badgoose.ie.